Star Wars deals with different state actors of various types throughout the various corners of its lore, from the Galactic Empire to the Republic, to the Sith, Yuuzhan Vong, Hapens, and beyond. But what, if anything, do national identities and nationalism look like in Star Wars? How do individuals see themselves in relation to these states or other political bodies? That's what we're going to try to break down today, primarily with reference to legends, but also a bit of canon, since there are a few places where I think some interesting points get made. To start though, we need to define what national identities are and what nationalism is. In his 1991 book Imagined Communities, Benedict Anderson describes a nation as just that, an imagined community. By imagined, he means that, quote, the members of even the smallest nation will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear of them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion, end quote. So essentially it's the idea of some grouping of people that goes beyond the individuals you'd see in just everyday life, with some set of shared characteristics that makes them all part of one bigger whole. But beyond that idea, what it means to be part of that community or what the roots of that community are can vary. For a lot of people, hearing nation may bring to mind the idea of nation-states, in the sense that you may call the Galactic Empire an interstellar nation, but it's not always analogous. Nationalism can be understood as an ideology which seeks to have the state, meaning the government and territorial control, be a more direct representation of whatever the conception of the nation is. Sometimes the basis of a national identity is on ethnic grounds, religious grounds, linguistic, or some mix of all those and other factors. But today what we're specifically looking at is how individuals within the Star Wars galaxy identified themselves, and how national identities formed within the Republic and within the Empire. Nationalism in the Republic's long history tends to take a few different approaches, but the Republic as a whole encouraged the idea of liberal civic nationalism. If, for example, ethnic nationalism is based on the idea of a shared history between people of a specific territory, civic nationalism holds that it's participation in a political system which determines national identity. So for example, there's the idea that all it requires to be a member of a nation is the shared value of democracy or something like that. When talking about revolutionary French and American national identities, Stephen Auer describes civic nationalism by saying, quote, membership in the community was thus defined primarily in political terms. Civic virtues were more important for the New Republic than ethnicity, common culture, or even common language. The only means of exclusion were the territorial bounds of a country, end quote. But also, it's worth noting here that we are talking about the kind of idealized way that people see their own national identity. Part of these being imagined communities is that for each person in the community, there's probably a different conception of exactly what it means to be within that nation. And that also means people who will make the same claim to being American or French in those periods, or within some similar identity within the Star Wars galaxy, there can be the belief that not being of a particular ethnic background won't exclude you from the identity and from participating in society in the same way, but the lived experience of people can be very different, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But in any case, the means of exclusion part is important, since nationalism, like most other identities, tends to require the definition of a people in reference to an other. So if membership in this group means something, then it also means something to not be a member of this group, and what are the grounds on which that's determined? So for a civic nationalism, it's supposed to just be that they live within the bounds of this national area. And we can see a bit of how this plays out in Episode 1, where Anakin being a slave on Tatooine outside the bounds of the Republic's control is something that Padme expresses some incredulity about. The Hutts who control Tatooine are therefore one such other against which identity is defined. The Republic, to the extent it claims any national identity, bases it on the ideas of freedom and democracy rather than the explicit idea that one specific species or culture makes up the national character. The Republic wouldn't claim to be human, for example, or that basic is the language of all who consider themselves to be Republicans or Republicites or whatever else they'd be called must speak. In the High Republican canon, there's a much more direct reflection of this idea of a Republic identity, identifying yourself as a member of the Republic rather than just with, say, your planet or sector or some other polity seems to be more heavily reinforced. That period, as the name implies, is supposed to be the height of the Republic, where they're in a peaceful and prosperous age, and "we are all the Republic" is a common phrase. At the Republic Fair on Valo, before it was attacked by the Nile, Chancellor Lina So gives a speech saying, quote, Some have traveled far, some are close to home, but we are all one. We are all the Republic, and this fair is for all of us. This day is for all of us. Together we will experience new things. Together we will witness marvels from across the sectors. Art, music, drama, innovation, they belong to us and they bring us together. This is a chance to understand one another, to realize once again what we all bring to the Republic, each and every one. This is our time, end quote. So rather than just have the Republic be this government that exists to serve a specific function, there is supposed to be something to the idea of being a member of the Republic, to being a citizen of the Republic. This is supposed to be part of your identity. You are not just a Corellian, you are not just from Mon Calamari, you are also of the Republic. This isn't to say, once again though, that the ideals of a nation are actually reflected in practice. In plenty of situations, these nations won't even like this video or subscribe for more, which just means you'll have to instead. But if we jump forward in time, we can see what this means in practice a bit. The CIS, while we've already discussed the flaws in its own political makeup in prior videos, gained a lot of the popular support it did because of a feeling that the Republic, despite these ideals and this claim to a universal civic nationalism, was organized in such a way that many, particularly non-humans or those living in the Outer Rim, did not truly feel like a part of this national identity, even if they were not explicitly excluded. For example, one of the member groups or allies of the CIS were the nationalists led by Alto Stratus on the planet Jabim, the site of one of the most brutal battles of the Clone Wars, where even Obi-Wan Kenobi was briefly believed to have died, along with many other Jedi. Jabim had been subjected to pirate raids without the Republic or the Jedi stepping in to help, disillusioning many with the promise of the Republic, and probably fairly so. This also happens with the character Sujin's planet in The Mask of Fear, not explicitly a military invasion, but a crisis that was facing his planet but which was ignored by the Republic. Attacks on Coruscant or other core worlds or similar problems faced by them would be unlikely to be ignored in this same way, and we see this yet again in the New Jedi Order series, where Outer Rim worlds were being attacked by the initial Yuuzhan Vong invaders, and the New Republic under Chief of State Borsk Valia did not take it seriously. So to a certain extent, while well-meaning, the civic nationalism expressed by the Republic in practice often turned out to be more of a nationalism which believed that the primarily human-dominated core culture and interests were the universal experience of the rest of the galaxy as well. So while civic nationalism attempts to avoid the issues of ethno-nationalism, the rise of which can pretty easily morph into fuel for intentionally exclusionary, totalitarian, and then directly fascistic movements by claiming the state as existing as an expression of a specific ethnic group, critics of civic nationalism warn of it sometimes having similar effects, even if unintentionally. Charles Taylor in The Politics of Recognition argues for the importance of recognizing distinct groups within a multicultural society, along with the potential need for either specific protections or, to some extent, self-governance for some groups, although this sometimes gets argued as reinforcing the idea that the quote-unquote regular government exists to reinforce another specific national identity. We can see some of this playing out within the Republic, which is a multi-level federal government. Planets have significant amounts of local control, but many of these lower-level governments do engender their own form of national identity and nationalist sentiment, and despite the Republic itself claiming to be based on a civic nationalism, many of those do end up being ethno-nationalisms. The government on Malastare, for example, became dominated by the Gran, who violently oppressed the Dugs, with the local government being explicitly by and for the Grans. This government was then also supported by the Republic itself as the official government of the planet. Similarly, on Mon Calamari, I recently covered the relationship between the Mon Calamari themselves and the Quarren, where the planetary government was a Mon Calamari monarchy. In Episode 1, we also see the local government on Naboo, and its representation in the Senate is geared towards the Naboo rather than the Gungans, though in both of these later two examples, we do see progress over time in bridging these divides. But both with the non-humans and rimward humans who felt less tied into the core, metaphorical or literal, of Republic identity, and with those who did feel stronger ties to the Republic as part of some national identity, other more local national identities, be they Corellian, Naboo, or Coruscanti, still played a significant role during the Republic period. There's much deeper you can go with different layers of identity and how nationalism, or the lack of any nationalism, may fit within a state, including how the inclusion and exclusion work in a national identity. But I do have to pretend this is a Star Wars video still, so we'll move on to the Empire, where we can explore at least some of those ideas a bit more. In the transition from Republic to Empire, a new national identity for the Empire itself did begin to supersede individual planetary national identities. And while it used to be a question of how well the Republic could accommodate cultural differences or meet the needs of its further flung citizens, it became essentially the point of the system under the Empire to ignore that. Palpatine enjoyed widespread popular support among many groups, which canon shows in the new Mask of Fear novel by Alexander Freed as well, where the galaxy credits him with ending the devastation of the Clone Wars, and we see something similar in Kenobi with the trucker alien. A lot of the planets that were most impacted by the Clone Wars would have been farther out in the galaxy towards the Rim, so him stopping the fighting would have been seen as a huge positive. But leaving aside that the war was orchestrated by him, part of the centralization of power under Palpatine was the creation of a new national identity. This is something that even extends into the fanbase. Think of how many people refer to the quote-unquote Imperial accent, aka British, and where characters are now considered to be Imperial rather than from a specific homeworld. Within the Rebellion or New Republic, characters like Han or Corran Horn are referred to as Corellian rather than Republican, whereas for someone like Pelion, him being Corellian, albeit raised on Coruscant, gets referenced as being more akin to a hometown background in comparison to his clear Imperial identity, even though that wasn't what he was brought up under. Part of this can also be seen to come from the very centralized way the Empire and its leadership functions, not just in terms of authority being centralized, but in how even things as simple as training programs worked, with individuals from fairly diverse planetary backgrounds being brought together and trained, if not directly in the core, then in facilities where Imperial culture, exported from the core, dominated. Luke was from Tatooine, but had he actually gone off to the Imperial Academy, he would have been integrated within this new Imperial national identity. For another example from Disney canon, Lost Stars demonstrates this pretty well. The main characters are pulled from what would be seen as a backwater system, kind of like Tatooine, from two distinct cultures even on their planet. But through their training, what gets emphasized most is their inclusion in this Imperial national identity. That still leaves the question of what this tended to mean for those who were just civilians of the Empire, since we're mostly talking about how this propagated through the military, and similarly through the other direct agents of the Empire. From governors down to local level functionaries, there was a cultural uniformity expected beyond just their participation in their actual duties, in a way we typically don't see in stories about the New Republic or the Galactic Republic, where the individual cultural background of characters are allowed to remain far more often. And if the big way this new Imperial cultural identity was spread was by inclusion in the military or in government jobs, then we also have to look at who is excluded from those methods of expanding the national identity. While any human from any world might be fair game to be included in the new empire, in most cases those jobs were not open to non-humans. So at an increasing rate, non-humans were the other against which this imperial identity would be formed. And this was not an accident. The nature of this culture was explicitly human-based and particularly core-centric. It was, for all intents and purposes, an ethnocentric nationality being built where true participation in, or benefit from, the nation-state came alongside fitting that newly constructed national identity. This new identity had its roots in long-standing ideas of high human culture, and the building of this identity shows another thing Anderson discusses in Imagined Communities. In many cases, though Anderson would argue in all cases, these identities tend to point to some view of history, choosing the elements which make this national community seem to have always been some kind of distinct unit. For the Empire, a lot of it was based around the idea that a lot of the accomplishments of the Republic were the accomplishments of humans. There were ideas of Republic military tradition being built up over millennia since the creation of the Republic Navy in the war with the Tyranids, which then built up more in conflicts like the various Alsakan revolts, which often had distinct human versus non-human flavors. In the years leading up to the Empire directly, some of Palpatine's greatest supporters were organizations like Compor, or the Committee for the Protection of the New Order, which pushed for stronger executive power for Palpatine, which was largely organized around humanocentric ideals. This then became Comp Nor, the Committee for the Protection of the New Order, a form of cultural purity police that existed directly within the Imperial government. Other specific individuals, like Grand Moff Tarkin, who wasn't from the core but was from Ariadu, a more wealthy human world in the Outer Rim, were open in their belief that only humans could truly organize the galaxy. And the Sith believed this as well. Darth Plagueis, the master of Darth Sidious, was not human but saw the need for Palpatine to rule instead of himself, even in the days of the Republic, saying, quote, "You have the political skills, and more to the point, you are a human. In this era, only a human is capable of rising to the top of Coruscant's biased political heap," end quote. For those within this identity, anyone in the galaxy could be an Imperial subject, but truly being an Imperial was a different matter. Exceptions could be made for individuals who went above and beyond to prove themselves, like Thrawn, but this largely just meant participation within the state rather than inclusion within the national identity. That's going to do it for our look at nationalism within Star Wars. There is, again, way deeper you can go with a lot of this. Like so many terms in political science, nationalism is highly contested, and it's hard to cover everything in a 15-minute video with a bachelor's degree and no more access to the university library, so apologies to any professors who may somehow stumble across this. It may be one to revisit down the line with a much longer video. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed it. Please leave a like and subscribe for more if so, and let me know in the comments if there's another topic you'd like to see covered on the channel. Special thanks to Marmar for editing this video, and to the patrons whose support makes all of this possible.